Welcome to the Tonestone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Nico Roymans, Professor of European Archaeology at the Free University of Amsterdam. Professor Roymans, welcome to the program.
Okay.
So I wanted to talk today about your specialty, about the archaeology of the Roman Netherlands, and about the Romans in Northwestern Europe more generally. So ancient texts describe a number of Germanic tribes, such as the Batavi and Frisii, that lived in the territory of what's now the Netherlands before and during the period of the Roman conquest. How much do we know about these tribes, both from textual evidence and from archaeology?
Yeah, you're mentioning two different tribes, the Frisi and the Batavi. The Frisi are situated outside the Roman Empire. Apart from the very early part of the imperial period, they were for a short time part of the empire. And the Batavi are, of course, incorporated into the Roman Empire. And the sets of evidence we have is very specific for these two groups. We can distinguish between archaeological evidence on one hand, and within the archaeological evidence we can speak of several subcategories, and of course the written evidence. And for the Frisi, we have, very little historical documentation, but rich archaeological evidence, especially the core area of the Frisian region, that was the Holocene coastal area of the north of the Netherlands, and that was densely populated, and a lot of settlements were situated here on artificial mounds, the so-called turp settlements. And several of them have been excavated, and so we know what kind of houses there were and the development of these settlements through the centuries. So we are quite well informed about the Frisian region from an archaeological point of view. For the Batavian region, we have much more evidence. We have not only important settlement evidence and evidence about cult places and cemeteries of simple rural settlements and semi-urban settlements. But we also have a rich written documentation. On the one hand, that is Tacitus' rich account of the Batavian Revolt of 68-69 AD. But we also have a lot of epigraphical documentation. We know, for example, of over 60 Batavian individuals who mention their Batavian origin. And they are spread all over the Roman Empire because they were functioning as soldiers. And apart from that, we also were so lucky for the Batavians that they had left traces in Vindolanda in Britain, the Vindolanda writing tablets. Most of the evidence of these writing tablets relates to a period when a Batavian cohort was situated there. So a lot of evidence, different kinds of evidence, and it is of course a challenge to combine these different sets of evidence. And I think we can say that the Batavian area is one of the best documented regions of the Roman Empire. So we are very lucky about that.
That's fascinating. Often the assumption is that the frontiers are less well documented, when of course it's the opposite in many cases, thanks to the soldiers. So during his conquest of Gaul, Caesar led the first Roman army into what is now the Netherlands, where he claimed to have destroyed two migrating tribes. Can you tell us about the recently discovered evidence for his massacre of these tribes?
Yeah, that's a long story. We are in the Netherlands in the Holocene river delta of the rivers Maas and Rhine. And there is a lot of dredging going on for decades already. And one byproduct of these dredging operations are archaeological finds that were brought up by dredging boats. And there is often rich archaeological material. And there is one specific spot in the Dutch River area, and that's near the place Kessel in the center of the Dutch River Delta, near the ancient confluence of the Maas River and the Rhine River. where a lot of military equipment was discovered in the course of several decades. And that was weaponry, swords, spearheads, fragments of helmets, ornaments. And initially, I interpreted that material as evidence for a cult place related to a river junction. But then it turned out more and more that there was a rich amount of evidence of human remains that were brought up. And these human remains could not be dated initially because, well, they are isolated finds. But we had a lot of radiocarbon dates of these human bones. And it turned out that there is a clear peak in the mid-1st century BC. And then it's interesting to observe that a lot of the military equipment we have here from that same site is also datable to the mid-1st century BC. And the human remains were evidence from children, women, and males. So it was a very mixed population, but there are clear cases of violence, traces of violence on these human bones. And then we developed the thesis that we are dealing here with a battle-related find complex. And then we had, of course, the historical documentation, because then it turned out that Caesar is describing in great detail a battle of against two Germanic groups, the Tencteri and Usipetes, in 55 BC, who asked permission to enter the Gallic area and settle in northern Gaul. Caesar refused that, and he decided to march against these two Germanic tribes. And he had a battle, or in fact it was not a battle, it was a massacre when you read the evidence. And he destroyed these two groups, and the final battle took place at the confluence of the rivers Maas and Rhine. And that's exactly the place where we find these human bones in great numbers and these military material. And so that was the basis for the hypothesis that we were dealing here with the remains of the battle described by Caesar. Of course, we can never pinpoint and date the archaeological material to exactly that date, 55 BC, but it is quite acceptable that when you have so much material related to a battle around the mid-1st century BC, and then at that place when such a battle is described here, that you make that conclusion. So that's, in a few words, the core of the story of these two tribes. And it was really a massacre because Caesar, of course, he is exaggerating, but he is describing that the complete population, males, women, children, here were massacred. And we also know that these groups were not local in the area. They were coming from the other side of the Rhine, so they were immigrant tribes. And that's important because we also were able to carry out isotopic research with these human remains. And it turned out that these individuals, where we had the entire tooth material, that they turned out to be people of non-local origin. And that also confirms that we were dealing here with people who were coming from another area. And that's also a confirmation of the story of Caesar, that these were immigrant tribes.
Yeah, it feels like an excellent coincidence of text and archaeology. Of course, you say we can never be absolutely sure, but it feels hard to think of it as anything else but that massacre. Well, that's fascinating. To move forward in time a little bit, so the southern half of the modern Netherlands became part of the empire, south of the Rhine, and remained Roman for centuries. What does the archaeological evidence tell us about the Romanization, to use an old-fashioned word, of the region's inhabitants.
Yeah. Yeah, Romanization, we know that Romanization is not a uniform process that develops in
Of
every
course.
part of the Roman Empire in the same way. There is a lot of regional variation, and from that point of view, we can say that the areas of the southern Netherlands had a very specific Romanization trajectory. When you would have traveled in the countryside of the Batavian region, you would have seen there a lot of small rural settlements with traditional byre houses, which were already there in the pre-Roman Iron Age. They were practicing mixed agriculture, mixed farming, with an emphasis on animal husbandry, especially cattle breeding. And so, from a general point of view, the first impression would be that these were people who were not so very much Romanized. Normally, you think of rich countryside, Roman villas everywhere, and monuments, local monuments, and so. But that's not the case here. But it is a pitfall, because when you look at the material evidence from these rural settlements, there is a lot of military equipment, fragments of Roman military equipment that was preserved in these rural farmsteads. We find evidence of wooden writing tablets, all kinds of elements that indicate a higher level of Romanization, but a Romanization that followed the trajectory of the Roman army. And that is related to farming population, which had fairly traditional settlements, but who were exploited by the Roman authorities in a very intensive way, in a sense that they were exploited as a kind of breeding ground for auxiliary soldiers on a very intense scale. And we have written evidence for that especially the Batavians, but also the Tungri and the Canonavates, they were providing auxiliary cohorts, and the Tungri and the Batavians also cavalry units. So that military recruitment was so intensive that we have the idea that almost every Batavian settlement, for example, must have had one or two sons in the Roman army. And that also may explain that we have several epigraphic evidence for two brothers serving in the Roman army. So that military recruitment was triggering a very specific Romanization trajectory. I think these people here in the frontier zone, these Batavi, had a better knowledge of the Gallic, of the Latin language than people more to the south in Gaul. But that is all related to the close association with the Roman army.
Hmm. Right. You said it's important to contrast the military-driven Romanization with, say, southern Gaul, where you see, right, those grand monuments and the villas. So you mentioned earlier the famous revolt of the Batavi in 68-69, led by a local aristocrat, Gaius Julius Civilis. So what do we know about, thanks to Tacitus, the causes and nature of the revolt of Civilis, which would become so important later to Dutch national identity?
Yeah, it's of course well known that there is a long history in Dutch national history of studying the Batavian Revolt as an example of a national revolt against the Habsburg Empire in the 16th century. It was an analogy. It was very popular. But we now realize more and more that there are several dimensions interacting in the period of the Batavian Revolt. There are elements that indeed indicate that it was a kind of native revolt, but it was much more complicated. It was also important to observe that a revolt took place at a moment when there was a civil war going on because of the death of Nero in 68. So there was different parties were fighting against each other, and in this constellation, the Batavians were forced to provide extra troops to an amount that it was difficult to realize that. And the Tacitus clearly specifies that the extreme burden of extra troop supplies was very heavy and almost unacceptable for the Batavians. So that was also a factor that was relevant, because these extreme troop recruitments were also organized in an official treaty between the Batavians and Rome, and Antiqua Societas. And so what was happening here, that they were so intensely taxed for military supplies, auxiliary supplies, that was too much for them. And then interesting also is that there may be also a very individual element here in play, and that is Civilis' close relationship with Vespasian, which he met during their stay in these both persons in Britain. And we know that Vespasian was the winner of that civil war. And I think one reason that the Batavians were pardoned for their revolt and were getting permission to continue their old conditions for participating in the Roman Empire was that they took the side of Vespasian and choose the right party. So different elements are playing a role when you want to explain the period of the Batavian revolt and the causes for that. It's not simply a native revolt, other factors are involved too.
Yes, and that's an important detail. It can be tempting to oversimplify these things, whether in the interest of nationalism or for any other agenda. So as you mentioned, they were able to get good terms from Vespasian, probably because they were on the winning side of the Civil War. And so after the suppression of the revolt, the Netherlands returned to, in many ways, the situation they had been in before, where the army is governing local affairs. There's a large military presence. And as you mentioned before, the military is really dictating a large part of the local economy. And so in this sense, thanks to the military being so ingrained in local society, how integrated are the Roman Netherlands into the economy, the Roman economy as a whole, I would say, and the economy of the Northwest in particular? And to focus on the towns, how can we compare or contrast the towns of the Roman Netherlands with those we see in, say, Northern Gaul or in Britain?
Yeah, to start with these towns, the Lower Rhine region, the Dutch part of the Lower Rhine region, that was part of the Roman Empire, there the groups were organized according to the Roman civitas pattern. So there were civitates, the civitas of the Batavians, the canonavates, and the Frisiavones in the coastal region. They had their capitals. And we know two capitals quite well, the capital of the Canonavates, Forum Hadriani, and Nijmegen or Noviomagus, the capital of the Batavian civitas. Both were foundations which were, following the layout of a normal Roman town. A street grid, a forum, and with public buildings in the center. Of course, not that rich, but it is quite normal for the general layout of towns. The countryside, because of course there is a close relationship between town and countryside. The countryside is rather poor. The Dutch river area and these sandy soils directly to the south that are not rich agricultural lands. The emphasis was on cattle breeding. So when there are not so much Roman villas. There are a few, but most settlements have the character of so-called indigenous settlements with these traditional byre houses. So from that point of view, it's we see that these towns are modest in terms of richness. And from another point of view, we have to realize that it are typical frontier towns, which means that the Roman army had a great influence because they are situated along the limes, and the stationing of large groups of Roman soldiers also provided the stimulus for urban development, and that was also a factor that can explain the relative wealth of these urban settlements in the Dutch River area. That's more or less the essential elements of what we see in especially the second century AD. An increase of Romanization, but the military element is very strong and important for keeping up that economic development in the region.
So speaking of the limes, to what extent is the Roman frontier along the Rhine a cultural divide? How extensive is Roman influence among the tribes beyond the Rhine, in what's now the northern Netherlands?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What we can say is that directly north of the limes, north of the Rhine, and east of the Rhine, we find, only native-style settlements, but a lot of areas were very thinly populated. So we even have the idea that these areas north of the limes were to some extent controlled by the Roman army as so-called prata legionis, where the Roman army could let graze their cattle, and so it was a region that was not occupied in a literary sense, but controlled by Roman military authorities. And the limes was not, of course, completely closed, but movements of people were controlled. Not everyone could go in. There are reports of frequent raids of Germanic groups, so that was always risk for Roman groups in the limes region. But on the other hand, we know that north of the limes, for example, in the Frisian region, in every settlement we see a lot of Roman imports, pottery, glass objects, military equipment. So exchange was intensive. I think the Roman military authorities tried to control the limes Voorland, as the Germans say, the area of the first 100 kilometers as well as possible, but there was interaction, but at the same time there was always the risk of invading groups crossing the limes. We have several examples of that from the written record.
So moving forward again in time to the 4th century. So at this point, under the Tetrarchy, Trier becomes a Tetrarchic capital, and the Netherlands move closer than ever before to the center of imperial power. Do we see any traces of this new proximity to a capital in the archaeology of this period?
Yeah, that's also funny. You would expect that the proximity of Trier would have a positive influence, and functioned as a boost for urban development and so on in the Lower Rhine region. But the situation was completely different, and that is related to the point of the consequences of the 3rd century crisis in the Lower Rhine region. we know that the area towards the end of the 3rd century was almost completely depopulated. Almost every rural settlement stops in the later 3rd century AD. And there was not only a complete depopulation of the countryside, but also, a disruption of organizational structures. For example, the civitas structure was destroyed. The civitas capital of the Batavi, Noviomagus, was no longer inhabited. And the same is true for the civitas of the Calendar. So in the Limes area, we see that forts were still functioning as military forts, but not on a permanent, intensive basis as before. So we have a completely different situation here with a depopulated countryside. And one of the points of debate at this moment is, what was the cause of this depopulation? Was it the warfare going on in the 3rd century crisis? Was it were diseases playing a role? I think it's a combination of factors, and one of these factors may well have been deportation of groups by the Roman authorities from the Lower Rhine region, and deportation to the south to poorer inhabited areas in France. And unfortunately, the written evidence is rather poor here. For the late 3rd, early 4th century, but there are certain indications that these groups in the Lower Rhine area, these indigenous groups, Batavian and Calendar, were punished for their support to Postumus, Gallic Empire. And they were punished by deportation. And it's interesting to know that in central France, several indigenous settlements have been found with, these northern type wire houses. So that's a very interesting topic that, the Roman Empire had a direct impact in this depopulation because of the deportation of groups as a kind of punishment. A dramatic situation. It must have been a bizarre experience when you are traveling these areas empty. All these sites are deserted.
Wow, yeah, that is very dramatic, as you say.
Yeah.
Was there any repopulation before the end of the empire in the 5th century?
Yeah, that's of course the next story. What we know is that a repopulation or recolonization occurred, and that many settlements were reused again, because I can imagine that new immigrants were traveling the landscape and saw where previous settlements had existed, and where they reclaimed the land reclaimed the land for the second time. But that is a key issue, that these new groups were immigrants coming from the other side of the Rhine. And then we are here in the period of around 400 AD. The Franks are coming in, and the Frankish groups are repopulating the area. And we have now in the Netherlands, in the southern Netherlands, several of these indigenous settlements from around 400 AD excavated. They are of a northern type. They are farmhouses from northern Germany and from the other side of the Limes. And it turns out that in this period we are dealing with a completely open frontier, with an open limes. The limes did not function as it did before. And that can best be demonstrated by looking at the distribution map of gold Roman solidi coins. That was the the key coin for the late Roman Empire, the solidus. And when you see the distribution map, you see a lot of hoarding of Roman solidi and isolated solidus finds in settlements, in rural context, on both sides of the Rhine, on the north of the Rhine, the northern bank, as well as inside the Rhine, in these depopulated areas which were recolonized. And that demonstrates a very important point, that these newcomers, these Frankish newcomers, were having a special position in the Roman Empire, because they were used for auxiliary service. In the late Roman period, Frankish groups were well known for their military qualities, and they were paid with gold. So there is a huge gold flow in the late Roman Empire going to these Germanic, these Frankish groups. And the fact that a lot of gold is found in these settlements and was hoarded in these areas also shows that these groups were not taxed, as was quite normal in the Roman Empire, because gold was the standard payment. And from the government, it went to all sectors of society, but taxation was in gold, so there was a kind of gold cycle. But that was not the case with these Frankish groups. They seem to have been treated in a very special way, that they didn't have to pay taxes. So the gold went into one single direction only, and that explains that we find it in so many settlements, and that also explain that for example, also in the Merovingian period, the 6th and 7th century, we find so many gold elements, ornaments and so on. I can imagine that all this gold, Merovingian gold, is gold made out of melted down Roman solidi, paid in the period late 4th, early 5th century AD. So that this was the period of the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the key period was the period around 400 AD. When we also have written evidence that Roman generals tried to make contact with Germanic groups and pay them gold as a reward, and that is a more general process occurring along the Rhine frontier, but we see it very clearly in the Lower Rhine region.
Oh, that's fascinating. We always think of the fall of the Roman Empire as being this dramatic transition, or at least a potentially dramatic one. But it seems that here it's a very gradual and almost several stage process where it's first abandoned, or rather it's depopulated by the Romans themselves in the 3rd century, or replaced by these auxiliaries who then become the conquerors of the whole Rhine region. And then, of course, falls totally out of the Roman orbit. And so to close with kind of a more general question, and so of course the Netherlands, like Britain for that matter, is one of the relatively few chunks of the Western Empire that stopped speaking Latin. Of course, Gaul retains a Latinate language, as do Spain and Italy, but the Netherlands began speaking Dutch, or at least some Germanic language, around this time. Is the thought that this complete replacement of the old population by these new tribes, these Franks and other Germanic tribes coming in, does that account for the more dramatic linguistic transition we see here than we see, say, in Gaul?
Yeah, the language issue is, of course, also a very interesting one. The language boundary was going through Belgium, modern Belgium, and even certain parts of the extreme northwest of France was Dutch or Flemish speaking. Until the 17th century. So there was in the north a zone of a zone of Germanic language spoken there, but the reason for that distribution is, I think, simply the the region where these Frankish settlers came in, that was for an important part depopulated rural land. So when the new population comes in and it is depopulated, then you have a quite different situation than more into the interior of Gaul, where you see a continuation of the old Gallo-Roman population and a continuation of the old civitas towns. They were continued there, and that explained that the Germanic languages were not having that chance in the southern areas compared to these northern fringe area of the Netherlands and Belgium, where the countryside created an almost 100% Germanic-speaking population in the migration period. So I think that is the main explanation.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, Professor Roymans, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. And to everyone who's listening, thanks very much for tuning in.